have a special guest joining us now on the program. I'm going to lay a little bit of foundation as to what we're going to be discussing in this particular interview, especially since I got it mixed up right before we went to break. Okay, this is in regards to James Comey. James Comey was the director of the FBI from 2013 to 2017. James Comey has now been indicted by President Trump's Department of Justice for the second time. The original case was eventually dropped. This time, the indictment just happened a couple of days ago. The reason behind the indictment is that James Comey, at some point on social media some time ago, posted a photo of a design of seashells on the beach. Those seashells were designed in the numbers 8647. Again, seashells on the beach designed in the numbers 8647. Now, what does that possibly mean, right? Well, we know that the number 86 could often be used in sort of common vernacular as a statement to get rid of something. Sometimes in restaurants, if a certain ingredient has gone bad, 86 the tuna's bad. 86 the tuna, get rid of it, right? So that's 86 does oftentimes mean that. And then 47, of course, we know that President Donald Trump is the 47th president of the United States. So 8647. Get rid of the 47th president of the United States. It appears as though that could be an interpretation of this seashell picture. And it has now been decided that this was a threat to the president, hence the indictment of James Comey that we saw this week. So, a rather long-winded explanation just to bring on the person who actually can lend some insight into what's happening here. Chapman Rackaway from Radford University. We really appreciate you joining us this morning. This is the first time that we've gotten to meet. It's nice to meet you. I hope you're having a good Friday so far.
Likewise.
And thank you very much. We are having a pretty good Friday. We've been a little up, and we get a little loose in here on Fridays. So I haven't made zero mistakes in the stream so far, but it's going pretty well. You know, I want to ask, it's been so up and down when it comes to James Comey over the past however many years. When you saw that another indictment came down against him before you even saw the 8647, I'm wondering your first thought, kind of what jumped out at you right away when you saw he was being indicted yet again?
My first thought was it's almost like movie trailers from the 1980s for sequels, and this time it's personal. It looks like this is a vendetta that is ongoing between the Trump, well, I'm not even going to say the Trump administration, between President Donald Trump and James Comey. Because this one is a long reach on this one. The first one was pretty thin in its substance on its own, but to go after this one sends a message that this is much more personal than it is based on anything else except for maybe timing. The timing of this hot on the heels of the violence at the White House Correspondents' Dinner is the only other kind of factor that really makes practical sense in terms of being a driver.
When you look at that, well, first of all, I will note that it's taking everything in me to not do my 80s movie trailer voice right now. I've got it locked and loaded, yeah, that's pretty good. Now, when it
Yours
comes
is probably
to that
better than
timing,
mine.
maybe I'll save it. Maybe I'll save it for the end. We'll see. In a world, one of those. Now, when we talk about James Comey and how this could be personal, and it seems as though it's personal, can you give us a reminder of the history of President Trump and James Comey? Why does President Trump, or would President Trump, have reasons for personal issues with James Comey?
Well, a lot of this goes back to the 2016 presidential campaign, when President Trump was running then for the first time, and Comey was the FBI director. Uh, there was an active investigation that Comey was a part of about Russian influence in the 2016 campaign, and that there were these active disinformation efforts being coordinated through Russia to advance Trump's candidacy and eventually his election. So as Comey continued on investigating that through 2016, he increasingly got Trump's ire and his attention. Eventually, he decided not to put that case forward, which led to this brief period at the beginning of the Trump administration from about inauguration in January until March, when Trump was saying, "Oh, Comey's a good guy," and was seemingly happy with him, and then abruptly in May he fires him. So Comey had always been, to Trump at least, this sign of an entrenched, embedded bureaucracy that wanted to prevent Trump from advancing his agenda, thwarting his efforts. Comey became, especially as an Obama appointee, a pretty easy symbol of that kind of structure. So I think that if you look at how President Trump creates his narratives, that it's very much about, I'm the good guy and I'm being beset on all sides by these forces trying to marginalize me or push me out. Comey became a convenient villain for him in that, in the same way that he would create heroes and villains when he was hosting The Apprentice.
It very much, as you kind of laid it out well, that there is sort of a script element to this, right? It's sort of a very clean narrative that we can fit this into if we look at all the context. Now, I'm wondering, in terms of this case itself, what the substance of the case, what do you make of it? Is this something that is likely to result in serious consequences for James Comey? And why or why not?
I think this will end up being a lot like the first indictment that happened in late 2025, though it'll have a very different resolution. Um, because you have to get back to the what was Comey intending when he says 86? Now, the Trump administration, because there's already this angle against him, immediately went to the most extreme interpretation of 86, meaning to eliminate violently, to kill. And there's an angle where you can take that, in military terminology, the way that I understand 86 is that it's some sort of derivation of 6 feet down and 8 feet over, 8, 6, 6, 8. And so in the military, it usually meant that someone was neutralized on the battlefield. So there's the determination that something could mean kill. But as you've already pointed out, in the restaurant industry, or even go back, I did some research into the history of the term 86, and I can trace it back to Prohibition era, when 86 in speakeasies meant the rear exit, the secret way out. And in the restaurant industry, it often means just get rid of something. And even in the military terminology, it's changed a little bit. And when it relates to missions, it can mean abort or scratch something. So 86 has a lot of nonviolent connotations to it as well. You almost have to look at the Comey Instagram post with the seashells that says 8647 as though 86 has to exclusively mean a violent end. And I think there's so much out there in the history and the folklore of things that you'd be hard pressed to say that this was a clear violent threat against the president. You also have to look at the context of anything else that Comey has said. Has he said anything that would suggest that he meant this in a violent way? So I did a quick look through his Instagram. There's certainly ways that you can interpret it saying he wanted to get rid of President Trump, but he wanted to do that through regular legal means, like invoking the 25th Amendment on behalf of the cabinet or an impeachment. So if you take 86 meaning that way, it's very hard to interpret this as something that is a violent threat against the president. I think that at this moment, like I was saying earlier, when people's sensitivities are really high, and we have every right for them to be high after the White House Correspondents' Dinner. But if we interpret everything this broadly as, well, it naturally has to be a violent threat, we're casting the net so wide that you're going to have to deal with millions of prosecutions, because you can interpret a lot of things to be violent that are not necessarily so. And we can't cast the net that wide.
And everything that you just said, I've has been sort of, I've seen other reporting that indicates the same conclusion that you've come to, and I would imagine that the people working in the Department of Justice are also aware of all of these facts. And so, if there is this pervasive unlikelihood that this indictment results in a conviction, and you've already had one case against him that has been dropped, is there some sort of benefit to President Trump, his administration, the Department of Justice, towards sort of just repeatedly indicting James Comey and just bringing these cases that have a generally accepted unlikelihood of conviction against him? I mean, where does the benefit lie in that?
The Chronically Online would call this lawfare. It is, you know, borderline malicious prosecution, and even if it doesn't result in a conviction, even if it doesn't go to trial because it gets thrown out as the first indictment was, what you can do is, and if this really is a personally motivated agenda against Comey, he's got resources, but probably isn't a wealthy man. Hiring attorneys costs a lot of money. And so, one of the things, and you see it in the tech industry a lot, where they call it lawfare, is if you're facing a competitor who is a real challenger to you, one of the things you can try to do is bankrupt them by throwing as many lawsuits as you possibly can at them. It costs nothing as far as the president is concerned to prosecute Comey. There's a sunk cost in all of the attorneys that are there within the DOJ and available to them, but it definitely costs Comey money. Also, the other effect that this could have is on other people. If there's other people who are critical of the president and they're seeing this, they're thinking twice perhaps about saying anything publicly because they don't want to be the next target. They don't want to be the next example. They don't want to have to get these attorneys and have their lives dissected online the way that people like Comey have. So there can be some secondary benefits, if you will, on the Trump side, or costs for Comey that make this an easy thing for the president to proceed with, or for the Department of Justice to proceed with. We'll put it that way. And you mentioned something else that I think is important to touch on, is that there's probably a division within the DOJ on this case, the same way that there was in September when the statute of limitation was about to run out, and then attorney Lindsay Halligan pushed forward. Halligan was an interim appointee from Trump. Her loyalty was purely there, whereas more of the career lawyers who were there severely disagreed with her. Three of the internal memos that have been shared publicly since then said that they did not think there was enough material to go forward with prosecution back in September. Halligan went forward with it anyway. So there's probably that same kind of tension there. Halligan has moved on, but we have another appointment from the Trump administration who I believe is still interim. And that's important in this piece as well, because the first indictment was thrown out not for cause, but because Halligan was an interim appointment and therefore wasn't eligible to bring the case forward. So we've got to see who's bringing this case forward and whether that is going to be a procedural thing that the courts are going to allow.
And the people in our viewing area here know Lindsay Halligan well, or at least recognize the name, because New York Attorney General Letitia James also had indictments brought against her by Lindsay Halligan. She stood outside of the courthouse here in downtown Norfolk after those were dismissed and spoke to press and a gathered crowd. So we certainly remember that entire situation here. Now, obviously, we can only read context clues. Nobody truly knows what the goals and mindset and thought processes are of those who have brought these indictments. I want to talk more broadly and conceptually about an aspect of lawfare that you mentioned, right? This concept of, well, we'll just go for bankruptcy. We can continue to bring lawsuits, or we can continue to bring charges against people who may be repeatedly found innocent, but ultimately will run out of money. Now, as a concept, that does not sound like the way the justice system is meant to operate at its very core. Are there rules in place to prevent that sort of thing?
Sometimes at the state level, there may be some guardrails, or you build a reputation with particular judges that cause them to dismiss with prejudice. But what you're pointing out is that a loophole in the system that a number of players have discovered, and that might be something that Congress should consider is some sort of legislation that puts guardrails around malicious prosecution and lawfare. It's a growing problem. It's something that's really only becoming, I think the public is becoming aware of now. You've heard that term lawfare, and it's particularly used by a particular group in the heavily online world. So I say that with the proverbial air quotes around it. But we're starting to see it more as a problem now. So I think that maybe legislatively we're about to start playing catch up with that. But yeah, it's a real problem.
It's certainly something to keep an eye on going forward. My last sort of line of questioning here, we can't discuss this without talking about Todd Blanche. Now, Todd Blanche is a new and frankly, at this point, still acting attorney general after the dismissal of Pam Bondi from that position. It's after he takes that seat that this indictment is brought. How do you view Todd Blanche's role and potentially motivations in this instance?
I think it's a lot like where Halligan was last fall, is the president values personal loyalty, and that loyalty being unstinting. I am confident Halligan felt a bit of that pressure. I am certainly confident that Blanche has either felt that pressure directly from Trump or understands what the stakes are, how much of a high profile, high value target for Trump is. And this would be an easy way for Blanche to establish just how loyal he is to the president by bringing this forward, especially if he's doing so over internal objections, just like Halligan did. So I would expect Blanche to be like a dog with a bone on this one and to not let this go lightly. With Halligan, after the case was dismissed, that kind of accelerated her pathway out of the office. I can see Blanche being much more persistent on that. The stakes are higher position, and he's got more of a standing relationship with the president that he wants to maintain there. So I think that as far as the story arc, it's going to look very similar. The motivations are pretty similar, even if they're amped up a bit from where they were in September.
All right, that's Chapman Rackaway joining us, the chair of the Department of Political Science at Radford University. Now, Mr. Rackaway, you have also written a book here, among many other books, called The Unorthodox Presidency of Donald Trump. It came out in 2021. Fair to say this could make for another chapter in that book?
Funny because Paul Rutledge, my co-editor at the University of West Georgia, and I are already talking about what the second volume is going to look like. So we're making our plans for what the unorthodox presidencies of Donald Trump, hopefully published around 2029, maybe 2030, is going to look like. But yeah, for what it's worth, Donald Trump is a unique president in American history. Of all of the 47 presidencies that we've had and the 43 people who have inhabited it over that time, there's been no one like President Trump. We've never had someone who came with zero political experience beforehand. There's no one who has looked at the whole swath of democratic norms that are before the federal government and wanted to actively disrupt them. There's been no one who had the name recognition coming in. So all of the normal processes of how political parties nominate their candidates, how presidents interact with Congress, how they interact with us publicly. He is a constant and constantly fascinating subject to study. And primarily, I look at political parties. So when I see how he really jumped the queue in his nomination and then completely transformed the Republican Party in his wake. It reminds me of just how different he is from any other president, for good and for ill. So yeah, he is, as far as studying and writing about, he is the gift that keeps on giving. But it is, for anyone who is following politics, it is a weird situation because he behaves unlike any other president that we have seen. I would say in history, the closest that we come is Andrew Jackson. So yeah, I'm constantly fascinated by President Trump and seeing what kind of long-term effects he's leaving behind him as this legacy, because we've never seen anything like it before.
And now, Professor Rockaway, I'm a person who I do love to nitpick and I do love to debate. Could I
Yeah,
offer a counter to one of your statements there? You
bring it.
mentioned Donald Trump. We've never seen a president with this much name recognition before going into office. Can I go all the way back to George Washington? And in terms of name recognition, can we square that?
It, if we're talking, I'm talking about name recognition in terms of vote, and at that point there wasn't a popular vote, so it didn't translate into a party primary and so on. I see why you're saying that. I had left something unsaid that probably qualifies that a little bit. But in the spirit of completeness, what you've said, absolutely 100% fair. Sure thing.
See, I knew I would regret trying to tango with a scholar here. I knew that was going to come. I figured I'd take a shot. I had to try, but we greatly appreciate you coming on. We hope to see you again. This has been really enjoyable.
Happy to talk with you anytime. It's been a pleasure, and we'll keep on having a great day.
Awesome. You too, Chapman Rackaway, Radford University, the chair of the Department of Political Science, and we really appreciate that insight there. That was great. And you have a great day as well. As for us here on Live Impact News, we're going to take a brief commercial break. When we get back, we've got more Live Impact for you.